The 1970s, a decade where musical boundaries were constantly being redrawn, where genres crashed into each other, and something extraordinary emerged from the wreckage. Yet for every band that made it onto the marquee, there were others just as deserving who never quite broke through. These are the acts that quietly shaped a generation, the ones who built something real while the spotlight pointed elsewhere. Number 1. April Wine. Any honest conversation about Canadian rock has to include April Wine. These weren't musicians chasing trends, they were builders, laying down a foundation in the early 70s that would hold their entire career together. The early lineup was shaped by the Henman brothers, but the group found its true identity when Miles Goodwin stepped in, bringing with him a rare combination of guitar chops, keyboard skill, and a vocal presence that could fill any room. 1972's On Record introduced them to a North American audience that was ready for what they had to offer. From there, the momentum never really stopped. First Glance in 1978 and Harder, Faster in 1979 pushed them further into the spotlight. Most people who know the name associate it with Just Between You and Me, the polished hit from 1981's Nature of the Beast. But that song was only possible because of everything April Wine had worked through during the decade before it. The relentless touring, the creative risk-taking, the careful blending of hard rock architecture with melodic sensibility. They drew from blues, from progressive rock, from pop, and made it cohere into something distinctly their own. And on stage, they delivered every single night. Number 2. Blue Oyster Cult.
Ask someone to name a Blue Oyster Cult song, and they'll almost certainly say, "Don't Fear the Reaper," possibly with a joke about cowbells attached. And while that sketch cemented the song in popular memory, it also had the unintended effect of reducing a genuinely remarkable band to a single punchline. Blue Oyster Cult were storytellers first and foremost. They built songs around mythologies, science fiction, and the occult, creating a body of work that rewarded close listening. Burnin' For You and Godzilla are just two examples of their ability to fuse hard-driving rock with lyrics that actually had something to say. They weren't chasing chart positions, they were constructing worlds. The albums felt like journeys, layered with detail and atmosphere that set them apart from the straightforward arena rock of their era. Their influence on the generations that followed is well documented.
Metallica and Alice in Chains both pointed to Blue Oyster Cult as a foundational reference, drawn to that combination of raw power and genuine intellectual ambition. That's a harder thing to pull off than it looks, and Blue Oyster Cult made it look natural. Number 3. The Dead Boys. Stiv Bators was not a performer you forgot. Volatile, committed, and completely without filter, he was the perfect frontman for a band that embodied American punk at its most uncompromising. The Dead Boys arrived in the late 70s with 2 albums, Young, Loud, and Snotty in 1977 and We Have Come for Your Children in 1978, and both records hit like a fist to the jaw. They didn't have the mythology of the Ramones or the lineage of the Stooges, but what they had was an authenticity that couldn't be manufactured. These were not musicians playing at rebellion. The chaos was real, the aggression was genuine, and the energy they brought to a live stage was something audiences didn't easily forget. Sonic Reducer remains the crown jewel of their catalog, a punk anthem so strong that Pearl Jam and Guns N' Roses both saw fit to cover it decades later. The music was stripped down to its bones, raw guitars, locked-in drums, and vocals that snarled rather than sang. The lyrics confronted disillusionment head-on, speaking directly to a generation that had run out of patience. The Dead Boys burned fast and left a short catalog behind, but the imprint they left on punk rock has never fully faded. Number 4. Hawkwind. There is no clean genre label for Hawkwind, and that was always the point. Over the course of the 1970s, they moved through hard rock, acid rock, progressive rock, psychedelia, and early punk without ever fully settling in any of them. From their self-titled debut in 1970 through 8 more studio albums before the decade closed, they treated each record as an invitation to go further out. And they never really stopped. Their most recent album arrived in 2021, more than 50 years after they started. Silver Machine gave them a genuine hit, and Urban Guerrilla generated controversy. But mainstream chart success was never the measure by which Hawkwind defined themselves. Their audience was European in the main, though bands like Ministry and Black Flag across the Atlantic absorbed the lesson Hawkwind was teaching about sonic extremism and ran with it. The live experience was something else entirely. Extended improvisations, hypnotic rhythms, science fiction themes played out on a stage designed to feel like another dimension. The personnel shifted constantly, with figures like Lemmy Kilmister, Ginger Baker, and Nick Turner each leaving their mark before moving on.
What remained constant was the commitment to pushing further than anyone expected. Number 5. The Ides of March. Vehicle is the song that most people know, and it is a great one. Those horns, that energy, that unmistakable hook. But stopping there means missing the larger picture. The Ides of March were a Chicago-area band with genuine range, and Jim Peterick, who would go on to co-write Eye of the Tiger with Survivor, was the creative engine behind a group that had far more to offer than a single charting single. The horn section wasn't decorative, it was structural, woven into the DNA of their sound in a way that gave tracks like Superman and LA Goodbye a weight and texture that separated them from the guitar-driven rock of their contemporaries. Between 1970 and 1973, they put out 4 studio albums, each one moving their sound forward while holding on to the core qualities that made them distinctive. They folded in blues, jazz, and progressive elements without losing coherence, and they built a Midwest fan base that was fiercely loyal because the band always showed up and delivered. One-hit wonder is the wrong frame entirely. The Ides of March were a working band with serious craft, and the catalog backs that up. Number 6. Little Feat. Little Feat resisted every attempt to pin them down. Founded in 1969 by Lowell George and Bill Payne, they spent the following decade assembling a sound that borrowed from rock, country, blues, and jazz without sounding like any of them in particular. 8 studio albums between 1971 and 1979 document a band in constant creative motion, never content to repeat what had already worked. The rhythm section of Roy Estrada on bass and Richie Hayward on drums gave the music a deeply funky foundation, while Payne's keyboards added harmonic depth and George's slide guitar and vocals provided the soul.
Jimmy Page was among the admirers they attracted. Not exactly a person whose praise you can dismiss. Their influence spread in directions they might not have anticipated. When the Dixie Chicks, now known simply as the Chicks, were looking for a name, they found it in Dixie Chicken, Little Feat's 1973 live favorite. That kind of cross-generational reach speaks to something lasting in the music, something that kept finding new listeners long after the band had moved on from their peak years. Number 7. Montrose. The name Montrose tends to pull people straight towards Sammy Hagar, and there's no argument that his vocals on the 1973 debut and the following year's Paper Money were exceptional. But Ronnie Montrose himself was the reason any of it worked. His guitar playing had a directness and ferocity that was uncommon even by the elevated standards of 70s hard rock. He didn't ornament, he attacked.
Alan Fitzgerald, who would later find a wider audience with Night Ranger, anchored the low end with precision and power, giving Ronnie's guitar work the kind of foundation it needed. Bad Motor Scooter, Rock Candy, and I Got the Fire are not merely good songs for their era. They are examples of the form done about as well as it can be done. Riffs that stick, rhythms that drive, and an energy that holds up across decades. Montrose became better known as a starting point for the careers that grew out of it. But judged on its own terms, the band was one of the genuine hard rock achievements of its decade. Number 8. Nazareth. Over 20 albums across 5 decades is not an accident. It takes a particular kind of dedication to the music, to the audience, to the identity of the band, to sustain that kind of output over that kind of span.
Nazareth, out of Scotland, have had that dedication in abundance since their self-titled debut in 1971, and they were still recording as recently as 2022. Most people locate them through Hair of the Dog or Love Hurts, both from 1975, and those are legitimate entry points. But Hair of the Dog and Love Hurts are not the whole story. They're just the most visible part of it. Nazareth built their reputation on consistent hard rock, delivered with genuine blues feeling, and they maintained that standard through lineup changes that would have broken lesser bands. Their live shows earned a reputation for intensity that matched the records, and the loyalty of their fan base across generations reflects how consistently they delivered on that promise. Trends came and went. Nazareth stayed the course. Number 9. Off-Broadway. 1979's On is the kind of debut album that deserves to be dug out and reassessed. Off-Broadway came out of suburban Chicago with a sound that split the difference between hard rock muscle and melodic songwriting, and they executed it with a confidence that didn't match their profile. Stay in Time got them onto the Billboard Hot 100, which was more than most bands from their scene managed. But the deeper reward on that record is Full Moon Turn My Head Around, a track that became the centerpiece of their live set and showed exactly what the band was capable of when they were fully locked in. Driving rhythm, soaring vocals, guitar work that knew when to push and when to breathe. They released one more album before breaking up, and the brevity of their run makes the quality of what they left behind feel even more like an open question. Off-Broadway had the tools, the timing just didn't cooperate. Number 10. Poco. When Buffalo Springfield came apart, Richie Furay and Jim Messina took what they had learned and built something new with it.
Poco formed in the late 60s with a clear vision to merge the energy of rock with the textures of folk and country in a way that felt organic rather than calculated. Picking up the pieces laid out the template in 1969, and the decade that followed produced 10 more studio albums that refined and expanded it. Crazy Love, in 1978, gave them their highest chart placement, reaching the top 20 on the Billboard Hot 100. But Poco's significance runs deeper than any single. They were among the first to articulate what country rock could sound like, and the bands that followed them into that territory, most notably the Eagles, drew directly from what Poco had established. Randy Meisner and Timothy B. Schmidt both passed through Poco before joining the Eagles, carrying the sound and sensibility with them. The commercial rewards went elsewhere, but the contribution was foundational. Number 11. Budgie.
3 musicians from Wales, 7 studio albums across the 1970s, and a direct line of influence to the most successful metal band the world has ever seen. Budgie's credentials are more substantial than their name recognition suggests. Burke Shelley's vocals had a range and an intensity that pushed the songs far beyond standard hard rock, and the band's willingness to work with unusual time signatures and shifting structures gave their music a depth that rewarded repeated listening. Metallica didn't cover just anyone. The fact that they chose Bread Fan from 1973 and Crash Course in Brain Surgery from 1974, and that Bread Fan in particular became a live fixture, tells you something concrete about the quality of Budgie's songwriting. Heaviness combined with genuine compositional ambition is a difficult balance to strike, and Budgie struck it consistently throughout the decade. They were laying groundwork that the thrash metal generation would later build upon, often without knowing exactly where the foundation came from. Number 12, REO Speedwagon. Before the polished ballads and the MTV rotation, REO Speedwagon were a hard rock band with a serious edge. The difference is Gary Richrath, whose guitar work in the 70s carried a blues-soaked aggression that the band's later work largely set aside. Ridin' the Storm Out, Golden Country, Music Man, and Flying Turkey Trot are not the songs that come to mind when most people hear the name REO Speedwagon, but they should be part of the conversation. These were tracks built on the fundamentals: heavy riffs, committed vocals, and a rhythm section that knew how to push. The live album You Get What You Play For from 1977 is the document that makes the case most persuasively.
Captured at a moment when the band was at their most raw and direct, it preserves a version of REO that the arena pop years tend to obscure. The band that made Keep On Loving You and the band that made Ridin' the Storm Out share the same name, but the 70s catalog belongs to a different and arguably more interesting chapter of the story. Number 13. Badfinger. What happened to Badfinger is one of the genuinely painful stories in the history of popular music, not because of tragedy alone, though there was plenty of that, but because the music was so good and the outcome so entirely preventable. Being the first act signed to the Beatles' Apple label in 1968 came with enormous expectations, and for a time, Badfinger met them. Come and Get It, No Matter What, Day After Day, Baby Blue. These were not minor songs. They were perfectly constructed power pop, built on strong melodies, tight harmonies, and a rock energy that felt immediate and genuine.
The comparisons to the Beatles were not just hype. When Apple Records collapsed, it took Badfinger's financial stability with it, and the legal complications that followed ground the band down over years. Pete Ham's death in 1975 was the defining blow. Tom Evans followed in 1983. Mike Gibbons passed away in 2005. Joey Molland is the only surviving member of the classic lineup. The music endures. It's still being discovered and covered and appreciated, but the story of how it all fell apart is a reminder of how the industry can destroy the very thing it claims to support. Number 14. Royce. Car Wash is inescapable, a perfect artifact of 1976, all rolling percussion and irresistible groove, the kind of song that attaches itself to your memory whether you want it to or not. But Royce were more than a soundtrack contributor with a memorable single. I Want to Get Next to You, released the same year, demonstrated their command of the slow burn, a smooth, romantic ballad that reached the top 10 and showed an entirely different dimension of the group's range. Wishing on a Star found an audience in the United Kingdom that recognized something special in those vocal harmonies and that unhurried, emotional depth, and the song became a top 10 hit there as well. Royce worked across R&B, funk, and disco with a fluency that made genre labels feel beside the point. Their songs carried genuine feeling, and the performances, both on record and in live settings, reflected a group of musicians who took the craft seriously. The Car Wash Association is not a burden exactly, but it does have the effect of making the rest of the catalog harder to find for people who haven't gone looking. Number 15. The Runaways.
4 studio albums in roughly 2 years, a fan base in Japan that treated them like conquering heroes, and a direct line of descent to 2 of the most significant guitarists in rock history. Joan Jett and Lita Ford came out of the Runaways, and that fact alone would be enough to secure the band's place in the story of rock and roll. But Cherry Bomb, and everything around it, deserves recognition on its own terms. As music made by young women who understood exactly what they were doing when they walked onto a hard rock stage in the mid-70s and refused to be subtle about it. The reception in the United States was more complicated than it should have been. Japan embraced them immediately and completely. The burnout that came from relentless touring and conflicts with management ended the band before they had fully realized what they were capable of. In the years since, documentaries and biographical films have filled in the story for audiences who missed it the first time.
But there's something to the fact that the full recognition came late. The Runaways were doing something genuinely pioneering while it was happening, and it took a while for the broader culture to catch up. Number 16, The Suite. The trajectory of the Suite across the 1970s is a more interesting story than their reputation usually allows. They started as a bubblegum act, releasing singles designed for charts and radio, and they were good at it. Little Willie, Ballroom Blitz, Fox on the Run, Love is Like Oxygen. These are not accidental hits. They're crafted, confident, and built to last. But the band was simultaneously developing a harder edge, and by the mid-70s, that harder side was becoming the dominant voice. The glam presentation remained, but the music underneath had real weight to it. Duran Duran, Motley Crue, and Guns N' Roses all claimed the Suite as an influence. That's a cross-genre reach that reflects genuine impact.
The usual hierarchy of glam rock places Bowie, T-Rex, and the New York Dolls at the top of the conversation, and that positioning is understandable. But it consistently pushes the Suite to the margins of a genre they helped define. The commercial record and the artistic influence are both there. The recognition has just been slow to catch up. Number 17, The Sylvers. 9 siblings, most of them singing, all of them performing. The Sylvers were a family operation in the fullest sense, and between 1972 and 1979, they put out 8 studio albums that documented a band with genuine talent and a deep feel for what made a song move. Boogie Fever hitting the top of the Billboard Hot 100 in 1976 was the peak of their commercial visibility, but Hotline and High School Dance both reached the top 20, which means this was not a one-song story. Their harmonies were tight in the way that only comes from years of singing together, and their stage presence, built on synchronized movement and a shared energy that is hard to manufacture, made them compelling to watch. The challenge they faced was partly structural. A large group with a shifting membership doesn't lend itself to the kind of focused identity that the music industry prefers. And a sound that moved between pop and R&B without firmly committing to either made them harder to categorize and market. None of that diminishes what they actually made. The Sylvers produced joyful, soulful, deeply grooved music across a decade, and that catalog is worth returning to. Number 18. UFO. The roster of musicians who passed through UFO reads like a directory of hard rock and heavy metal talent. Vinnie Moore, Pete Way, Bernie Marsden, Michael Schenker, Paul Raymond, Ainsley Dunbar. Each of them brought something essential to the band at different points, and the music they made together holds up across every era of the catalog. Lights Out and Doctor are the tracks that found their way onto classic rock radio, and they earned that placement through sheer quality. But the full picture of what UFO accomplished is better understood through Strangers in the Night, the live album from 1979 that is consistently listed among the greatest concert recordings ever made. It captures everything: the energy, the precision, the way Schenker's guitar and Phil Mogg's vocals pushed against each other to create something greater than either alone. UFO were a bridge.
They connected the first generation of hard rock to the new wave of British heavy metal, and Iron Maiden, Def Leppard, and Saxon all acknowledge the debt.
That kind of influence, running through some of the most successful metal bands in history, is the mark of a group that mattered more than their chart positions ever reflected. Number 19. Wishbone Ash. Twin guitar arrangements are common enough now that it's easy to forget someone had to figure out how to make them work. Wishbone Ash figured it out. Andy Powell and Ted Turner developed an approach to two-guitar interplay that was unlike anything being done in hard rock at the start of the 1970s. Rooted in blues, informed by folk and jazz, reaching toward something genuinely progressive. The results were intricate without being academic, emotional without being soft. Over more than 20 albums spanning 5 decades, from their formation in 1970 to their final record in 2020, Wishbone Ash held to their identity even as the music around them shifted dramatically. The twin guitar approach they pioneered became a cornerstone of the Iron Maiden sound, was absorbed into Van Halen's thinking, and was explicitly cited by Lynyrd Skynyrd as a foundational influence. That's a lineage that runs through some of the most significant guitar-driven rock of the past 50 years. Wishbone Ash are where part of that lineage begins. Number 20. The Guess Who. American Woman announced itself in 1970 as something distinct, a hard-edged riff, a lyric with something pointed to say, and Burton Cummings delivering it with a vocal authority that left no ambiguity about where the band stood. The Guess Who had been building toward that moment since the late 60s, and in the decade that followed, they released 10 studio albums that moved through hard rock, pop, and psychedelia with a confidence that reflected the depth of the songwriting partnership between Cummings and Randy Bachman. No Time, These Eyes, Undone, Share the Land. These are songs that hold their place on classic rock radio not out of nostalgia, but because they are genuinely well made. The Guess Who's importance to Canadian music cannot be overstated. They were the first Canadian band to achieve the kind of international commercial success that proved it was possible. And every Canadian artist who followed them into the global market owes something to what they established. That they remain outside the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame is a position that is difficult to defend on the merits. The contribution is documented, the influence is traceable, and the music speaks clearly for itself.